Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Freaking out, blowing up, checking out, overreacting, losing it. We all have those disproportionate emotional responses to a situation that typically wouldn't affect us in such a dramatic way. If you're like me, you can think of a fairly recent time when you walked away from a conversation or situation feeling bewildered or embarrassed and thought to yourself, why on earth did I do or say that? You know in your head that your reaction was not rational, but your body was living out a different story, a deeper story that feels connected to something very real in your past or present, and that feels like a big deal to you, but you're not sure what that is yet. In the counseling world, there's a term for these responses, emotional dysregulation. And today, we are starting a new series on faith and feelings all about it. For those of us not familiar with this term, it might seem uninteresting or irrelevant, but this is actually a far more important topic than it sounds. In fact, few things are more relevant to your day-to-day, really your minute-to-minute life than emotional dysregulation. Another way to describe this term is the inability to control your insides. It's that unexpected spiral into anger, anxiety, or insecurity. It's what's happening inside of you during that unsettling relational interaction. It's what's going on when you burst into tears over losing your keys, or get unexplainably angry when you can't find something at the grocery store, or when you emotionally shut down when you feel like an outsider at a social gathering. It's those moments that have an out-of-body quality to it, as if you're watching someone else show up to your life. And no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to summon you back. If you're laughing right now because you can relate, or nodding your head because that was you just last week, you're in the right place. Over the next few months, we're going to dive deep into this topic and understand why we react these ways, and also how we can hold on to ourselves in dysregulating moments. But if you're wondering why I'm doing a whole series about this topic, here's why. A huge misconception about emotional dysregulation is that these overblown or shut down reactions happen out of nowhere. And when we mistake them for isolated events, we may feel embarrassed or perhaps a little perplexed. So we just keep going. We rush past them without a second thought, or we try to move on as fast as possible. Many of us don't realize that these revved up reactions tell a story about something we've lived. They point to a deep-seated something that has gone unaddressed in our hearts, a wound that hasn't healed, a memory that is still affecting us, whether we realize it or not. A belief that we absorbed as a child and that is still driving our decision-making and interactions today. We can often think that we've packed all those somethings safely away in a box so that we don't have to see them again. But then they pop out at a dinner party or spill out onto a child, spouse, or friend in the most unexpected moments. And I'm learning that one of the most important questions for our spiritual growth and emotional health is this: what was underneath that? These moments and reactions don't happen in a vacuum. There is always a reason why. When big, seemingly illogical emotions, reactions, or behaviors come up in response to something, I'm learning that wisdom looks like slowing down and getting really curious about our reaction. Our world moves at such an accelerated rate that pausing can often feel uncomfortable and counterintuitive. But here's the problem. Many of us are living dysregulated because we have decades of unprocessed stories that we continue to carry inside of us. We're living in overdrive or living emotionally shut down. Some of us for so long that we've forgotten what calm, present, or at peace feels like. I'm learning that growth, healing, and maturity begins with noticing these moments, saving them for later, and then processing them with God and safe relationships. We can go back and understand where they came from. We can understand the deeper story, and in doing so, be empowered to change our future responses. In a few minutes, I want to share a small story about a time when I was dysregulated. It's a story that I can laugh at now. It's slightly embarrassing, but too funny not to share. It's about a time when I was highly dysregulated, when it really mattered. But first, I want to share 2 reasons why processing these moments is essential for our emotional health and spiritual growth. Number 1, this is a first step in actually living a transformed life. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned how dysregulating moments always tell a story about something we've lived. If you think about our lives like a novel, the reason why these moments often feel so confusing is because it's like taking a novel off a shelf and starting to read at chapter 17. It makes no sense because we have no context. In order to understand why we react the way that we do, we have to understand the broader, deeper context to the story of our lives. We have to see what happened before in order to understand what's happening now. I've often seen a common misconception, especially among Christian circles, that God calls us to leave the past behind. But here's the problem with that. The past never stays in the past. There is no such thing as leaving the past behind. In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk often talks about how the past remains alive in us. It's constantly surfacing in the present and shaping and informing our future. So many of us want to live a transformed life. We're praying, memorizing scripture, and going to church every Sunday, but we're being crushed inside because we're not dealing with the brokenness of our past. We keep trying to leave it behind, but it's living inside of us. In his memoir, The Kite Runner, Khaled Hosseini described it in this way. I became what I am today at the age of 12, on a frigid, overcast day in the winter of 1975. That was a long time ago, but it's wrong what they say about the past. Looking back now, I realize I have been peeking into that deserted alley for the last 26 years. Dysregulating moments take us back to the most wounded and fearful versions of ourselves. They can bring up emotions that we are least acquainted with. But every time you and I experience dysregulation, we are also being invited into deeper healing and wholeness, oftentimes in areas that we didn't even realize were wounded. We are being invited back to that hurting 5 or 12 or 20-year-old version of ourselves that is still living inside of us. Dysregulating moments are invaluable to our emotional and spiritual health. They're priceless. Why? Because when we slow down and process these moments, we unearth sacred opportunities to witness the Spirit of God at work in our lives, who promises to lead and guide us into all truth. A truth that heals, sanctifies, and invites us to live from the heart God gave us rather than the hurt we've experienced. Like Khaled Hosseini described, it can feel like we are descending into our own version of a deserted alley, but what we're really doing is mining for gold. The second reason why processing dysregulating moments is essential for our emotional health and spiritual growth is this. It is at the core of existing in relationship with ourselves, others, and God the way He designed. It's not just about understanding the past, but also about our capacity to be present in our lives today. When we're in a state of dysregulation, we are no longer present. We are no longer operating in the here and now. This isn't a matter of willpower. When our bodies move into a state of dysregulation, we lose access to the parts of our brains that can make sense of the world around us and that can keep perspective. And above all else, our bodies were designed to find a way to regulate again. We're biologically driven to bring calm to our insides and to come back into the present moment if we've checked out. When we become dysregulated, we will do whatever it takes to get re-regulated. In fact, all coping strategies are, at their core, an attempt to self-regulate. Every dysfunctional way of existing, addictions, compulsions, are all attempts to self-regulate. If it's drinking, you'll drink. If it's overworking, you'll do that. And it's not because you're an alcoholic or workaholic, though you may be. It's that you're committed above all else to bring your body back into a state of regulation and keep it there. As you're probably beginning to see, an impaired ability to self-regulate wreaks havoc on our relationships. When we depend on dysfunctional behaviors to regulate, we cannot be present to God, to others, or to ourselves. These behaviors further isolate and disconnect us, causing us to feel powerless against a cycle of reacting and regulating out of unhealed wounds. As author and seminary professor Terry Wardle often says, if you have the fruit of dysfunction, you have the root of wounding. Another misconception that I've often heard in Christian communities is that introspection is self-centered, that we should be focusing less on ourselves and more on God and others. But I'm learning that processing dysregulating moments and getting to know the deeper story is one of the most humble and selfless acts of service that we can do. Understanding why we react the way that we do and learning to self-regulate in healthy ways is at the core of receiving the love of God deeply into our own areas of pain, shame, and wounding, and healing areas of dysfunction so that we can love Him and others well. So to wrap up this episode, I wanted to share one of my stories as I continue to process my own moments of dysregulation. This story is funny now. Trust me, it wasn't at the time. But the more I've processed it and understood the bigger context, the more I've been able to laugh at the irony of it all. So here's the story. It was right around the time that my most recent book, Stop Saying I'm Fine, Finding Stillness When Anxiety Screams, was getting ready to release. And as I tell this story, please make a mental note of that subtitle, Finding Stillness When Anxiety Screams. I was in my second year of grad school at the time, still living in a dorm, working, and a full-time student. Between work and classes and assignments and doing so much publicity for my book, life was absolutely insane. I was exhausted, and as you can probably imagine, my anxiety was pretty high. In the months before and after my book released, I was writing at 5 o'clock in the morning and finishing discussion board posts on planes to and from speaking engagements and doing interviews between work meetings. Everything, I mean everything I was talking about involved healing from anxiety, and I hadn't been that anxious in a long time. Around the time of my book launch, I was on several fairly well-known faith-based podcasts where I was invited to share my story. And I remember this one morning that I woke up and it was like as soon as my eyes opened and I looked up at the frame of the bunk bed above me, I thought, oh no, this is going to be bad. I was so anxious. I literally woke up on the verge of a panic attack. My level of emotional dysregulation was a 10 out of 10. The podcast interview was scheduled for mid-morning, and after getting up, I proceeded to do every coping mechanism I had ever learned in the history of my therapy journey. I did deep breathing. I did cardio. I took a shower. I ate protein. I went outside. I limited my caffeine intake. I prayed. I reached out to several mentors with an SOS please pray text. I listened to calming music. I even listened to whale sounds. Desperate times call for desperate measures. But no matter what I did, I felt out of my body. I couldn't find myself again. I remember this one moment when I was pacing around my tiny dorm room, called my mom, and immediately started crying. I was feeling pain in my chest and my heart was racing. I was shaky and my hands were sweating. Usually when I have panic attacks, the panic is linked to a very real fear. And this interview felt pretty huge and scary. But it wasn't just about the interview. I was getting ready to share my story of finding stillness when anxiety screamed and begging God that I wouldn't have a full-blown panic attack while I did. It was this moment for me of like, can I actually do this? Is my calling real or should I just throw in the towel? I felt so small, way too young, and intensely not enough. Those were the assumptions spinning in my heart and mind in that moment. So I talked to my mom, she prayed for me, and then I sat at my desk watching the clock tick down the minutes until I was supposed to join the virtual recording studio. And I thought to myself, I will never do this again. I will never do another speaking engagement or interview again. And I sat there trying to concoct all of these ways to show up to the recording and prove that I was trustworthy and professional. And that meant leaving this highly anxious part of me outside the door. I got through the interview by the grace of God, and afterwards I just sat there and stared at my laptop screen. What had just happened? Why had my body responded that way? And what was underneath that? I've unpacked and continue to unpack that morning for 2 years. And I'm realizing that the Taylor that showed up to the recording that morning was the 16-year-old version of me. At that age, I was in high school. I had just published my first book 3 years earlier, was writing for numerous publications, and had just started to speak. And I was always, the youngest in the room. Most of the time, I still am. And because of my age, I often feel like I don't have a place, like I'm not enough or don't belong or have to prove myself. And the times when my voice has been overlooked or discounted because of my age has only further solidified those beliefs in me. So I showed up to that interview in a tailspin of anxiety, trying to prove that I was enough, that I deserved to be there. Despite the promise I made to myself, that was clearly not the last time I was ever on a podcast. And as I've better understood my reaction in that moment and where it came from, I've been able to more fully receive God's love in that raw place of insecurity and anxiety. It's painful and embarrassing at times, but I'm learning to release my performance. I don't want to operate out of a place of woundedness or dysfunction, but of abiding. And I'm learning that whether God allows me to do these things from a place of groundedness or helps me breathe through them when I'm anxious, it's all grace. And it's reaffirmed in me the theological truth that it's in our vulnerability that God radically brings transformation and power that shames the powers of this world. So as we close, here's a little sneak peek to what's coming up next. Next week, with a licensed therapist, we'll dive deep into the ways we can get dysregulated and what it feels like in our bodies. It's an incredibly practical and helpful conversation. I learned so much during our recording. Then we'll jump into some amazing stories with guests where they share a personal story of dysregulation, and together we trace the deeper story. These conversations are so real, so relatable, and sometimes absolutely hilarious. You won't want to miss them. We'll see how the rhythmic practice of processing these moments and exposing them to the light is a tool of grace that creates an opportunity for connection with God, others, and ourselves in the present moment. We'll also see how our overblown reactions actually make so much sense, but why it's so important to heal from past wounds so they don't continue to resurface in the present. My hope is that these conversations will bring laughter, connection, and deep reflection, that they will increase our compassion and curiosity around our own moments of dysregulation and what might be underneath. Until next week. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.